Welcome to Family Features, a podcast for anyone who wants to experience healthy relationships within their family. This is Dr. Corey Gilbert, and I'm honored to come alongside you to encourage, educate, and equip you as we focus on the different relationships that make us family. Let's get started and focus on today's feature. Welcome to the Family Features podcast. Today, I'm actually excited to introduce our Christian Bohlen. Today, we're going to talk about where he's at, some of his story, resources, and just kind of what God's doing in his life. So welcome.
Thank you, Corey. It is so good to be with you. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Wonderful. I'm excited because we're going to go into just a lot of good stuff and a lot of hard stuff today, just kind of with your story and where God's led you to even write and put your story and your life out into the world as well. So let's actually start with just a summary of just kind of who you are and where you're at in life.
Sure. Yeah. So professionally, I'm an instructional designer. I build learning materials for corporations, and I was a teacher in a juvenile corrections facility for about 12 years, which was an amazing experience with everything from rural pranksters to killers and a lot of drug and gang and that type of thing. That was really amazing. And I was actually a rock and roll musician playing 6 nights a week when my wife walked into a club where we were playing for the first time. That was a brand new band for the first time. She walked in and we were married 6 months later.
Oh, goodness.
We were engaged within a month. And, at the time, God was already important in my life. And we had conversations about God and so forth. And everything just felt right. I mean, she made me feel amazing. She's just this light-hearted, loving personality. People call her a light. They just see her as a light. And I fell in love with her. She complimented everything about me. So I felt after answers of prayer that this was right. And I continued to pray about that even into the hard times, because as we're going to talk about, it got ugly.
How did you go from rock and roll musician to working at a lockdown facility?
Yeah. Well, another thing I'm very open about is that I am a recovering drug addict myself. And, God has a way of shaping our paths, as we all know. And so I already had a degree in mathematics and enough education credits to teach at this private facility. So after life on the road and the difficulties that quickly manifest in my marriage, I decided let's settle down and let's just get a real job kind of thing. So that was the transition. But it was, I'm not from the city. I'm not used to really hardcore kinds of criminal behaviors and culture and that kind of thing. So I was a little uncertain about taking this job. But again, I prayed about it, felt it was right. And it's ironically, that's where I grew up. Those 12 years is where I learned what it meant to be addicted, that I was, in fact, an addict, and I became a recovering addict.
Neat. And so this is a funny question I'm going to ask you, but
sure.
Kind of a big jump, but how common is mental illness in the U.S.?
It's shockingly common. So when I decided at my wife's urging to write this book that we'll talk about a bit later, started doing some of the research, and estimates are in the United States that close to 50% of all adults will have a mental illness at some time in their lifetime. It's like 49.3%. And in any given year, and this was before COVID, and COVID has absolutely heightened those numbers.
Exactly true.
And domestic violence has gone up, divorce has gone up, stress levels. All that does is it triggers people's latent, but if they're a little on the edge, this will put them over. But anyway, pre-COVID, it was 19% in a given year will experience a mental illness. And generally, I believe, Corey, you can correct me on this, that addiction is classified as a mental illness too. So I'm assuming that would probably include the estimates of addicts out there. But
I actually don't think it doesn't. I think that's added on top of that.
Is that right? Oh, wow. Okay, so that's an even bigger number.
Yeah, even bigger number. That, which is amazing to think about. And to think about, there's a story behind every person's place where they're at with an addiction. So then they bring that into someone else's life, like marriage.
Right.
How does that
Right.
impact marriage?
Uh, so addiction, we
Hmm.
know scientifically, changes the brain.
Hmm.
It spiritually introduces darkness, selfishness. Sin. There's a reason that scriptures call it the bondage of sin.
Yep.
It changes who we are, and we act differently than we would otherwise. So if we're persistent and in denial on the addiction, it just brings that sinful darkness in, and and a host of other factors depending on the kind of addiction. Porn addiction, of course, is a huge deal right now,
Yes, it
and
is.
destroying people's lives and marriages. And so, yeah, it brings an effect with it, I
It's idolatry.
believe. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's always a reason behind that addiction. There's more. We're really learning right now that a lot of our focus has been on the drug, on porn, or on other, medication type drugs, or
Mhm.
illicit drugs. That's the I would almost say we can really see that's the wrong focus. The focus needs to be on there's a reason why a person needs to or is choosing to escape or
Yeah.
numb themselves.
Yeah. In my case, I
Hmm.
found out later in my 30s, late 30s, that I have bipolar 2. So bipolar depression, I think it's typically called.
Hmm.
It's not the more typical manic where people, have these hours or days of just incredible energy. I tend to be on the depressive side.
Hmm.
I believe, like many mental illnesses, that this kicked in my teenage years, and I remember feeling like feeling kind of guilty with God in my heart, and when I was a teenager about using drugs. But at the same time, I thought I just feel so much better. I just feel at peace.
Yep.
And I mean, is it really that bad? And then, later I understand more why. But I think I was self-medicating because of my mental condition, partly.
Oh, absolutely. I would say there's not much doubt in that. It was just unknown as to more of the why that now you're coming into an awareness of.
Yeah.
I feel like our whole world's coming into more of an awareness of that. And I live in Oregon where it's, now cocaine's legal and all sorts of other ridiculous things are legal.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, it's crazy. There are groups that are like, hey, let's use mushrooms to as therapists to help.
Yes,
It's not okay, I think.
I've read about that. Yes, and I was a
But
partaker myself.
okay. But it's becoming more of a mainstream. Hey, try whatever to escape.
Right.
My fear is always, what are you escaping from? And
Yeah.
that's a scary one. Even thinking of your marriage, like it sounds like you guys have had a rough go, which even led to the book you've written.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the
Yeah.
two books even, but
Absolutely. So this new book called Happy After All, I think the name really says it. Shockingly, we really are happy after all, with still occasional hiccups, occasional
I love it.
severe pain. But I think our story is very significant.
Hmm.
One of the psychologists that helped me the most, I believe, at one point said, "Marriages like yours don't make it typically." He says,
Wow.
"You're a statistical outlier."
Hmm.
And outlier means it's so far out of the pattern that a data analyst would just throw it out, that piece of
Yep.
data. It just is. So I thought that was significant because he works with people, and most of his clients were borderline personality. So my wife's primary diagnosis is borderline personality, and then
Hmm.
she's also bipolar one, the classic bipolar. And uh, yeah,
You guys been married how many years?
35 years.
35 years. Oh, that's amazing.
We were separated 4 times.
Really?
Once and I credit those and I detail that actually in the book as one of the most important things that we did. I needed to do it to make myself safe and to set boundaries.
Hmm.
There's you know, boundaries can't be overstated how important they are.
Correct.
With addicts, and in our life it was critical. So each time after a separation we decided to give it another go. There was a measurable, palpable sense of greater stability, greater respect, greater for understanding for who needs what in this relationship. And then things would deteriorate in different ways, because these illnesses seem to just kind of manifest over the years, that different parts of their issues and personalities come out differently and get worse. And then we would separate again. One time filed for divorce, I canceled it. Another time I was intent on filing for divorce, and I didn't. I held, I stuck with that 6-month law of wherever the state I was living at the time. And I, in my heart, said, I'm not going to look anywhere else, at anyone else. Until those 6 months are past, I'm going to see what God is going to do. And miracles happened in my wife's life, that, including a very nasty accident. She's disabled by birth. Her leg is paralyzed from the left down, and she wore a brace to be able to walk, and slipped in the bathtub when we were separated and shattered it. It was horrible, and they had to kind of reconstruct it, and she was living alone. And so the full weight of, because borderline personality, they're obsessive about the love object, whether it's the parent, whether it's the spouse. There's somebody that has to fill all their needs, and it's always their fault if anything doesn't do it. And so when she was all alone, that evaporated, and she turned to God. Now, she had before, and it was sincere, but now she was stuck, sitting there, hardly able to walk. People had to help her get feed, and she would watch religious programming. And you could see an enormous change happening in her life. Wow. And at that point, I was like, oh man, we got it made now. We're finally over that. And so we moved back together again, bought a different house, and no, we weren't there yet. But it was better in major ways. So that's why the subtitle of our book is, and it was her idea, by the way, to write this book, which she has a lot of courage in here, because there's some pretty dramatic and not flattering stories in here. We never are like gruesome or anything like that, but it was her idea to write this, because she felt like other people need the hope that even severe and extreme situations like ours, that there is hope with God first.
Well, and so that's my question. So you then took a Christian approach to writing this book. What led to that being a key element?
So, well, I guess first and foremost, because we believe, I know I would not have survived without God in my life helping me. I mean, really connecting. And that's fundamental. And I became a Christian nonfiction writer in the last several years. And it just made sense that my whole passion, I know Christ is real. I know his power is real. It's too vivid for me to keep my mouth closed about it and to not share it. So yes, I wanted this to be for primarily a Christian audience. Any spiritually minded person, I think, of another faith would probably gain a ton of stuff from the book, but it's very much, Old and New Testament scripture. About 40% of it is really spiritual insights. The other 40% of what helped us make it is solid research-based mental health advice and recommendations. We read the literature. We went to see professionals, and there's a big disclaimer in the front of the book that nobody should try this alone if you've got these kinds of issues. You really need the professional help. We believe in medications. We know that there's some people that have different views about that, but for us, they work. They
life-altering for you.
Life-altering.
Yes.
Absolutely. Our marriage was harder until my late 30s, when I got properly diagnosed, because my tendency to depress made her crazy. Oh, that's a bad word to say, and I wouldn't say it in front of her anymore. She knew to that.
Yeah.
But just to use a common language, that it just drove her out of her mind, because she needed my energy and needed to feel the love, and she felt I was punishing her. So when I got more energy through the medication, I became more resilient, more able to be there for her. It just worked better. And then, of course, when her medications helped her not to go so up and down, then that helped me to not get depressed. So you get the two of us, we were quite a pair, you know?
Yeah. What if you could provide 3 pieces of advice to your listeners that are married to someone like you've described? What would you say?
Well, I'd say number one is to believe that you are empowered, that you can do things personally, independent of whether your spouse changes or not, to make you feel a lot better. And um, those things include spiritual learnings and application, and then this, more of the secular mental health recommendations. And we believe it takes both. But this is the key, and this is why the subtitle of the book is Hope and Help for You when your spouse has mental health or addiction issues. Because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Corey. You meet with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's our impression that when these marriages fail, and I need to get back to answer your question too, by the way, but when these marriages fail, it's the so-called healthier spouse that's like, I'm out of here. I can't take this anymore. Is that true? Or is it maybe the one with greater issues that bails out first?
I think I've seen kind of both ends.
Okay.
But it's one can't handle it. Actually, either of them couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
The healthier one, if you think of us as Christians, what breaks my heart is you're breaking that covenant because it's not easy. Marriage is not meant to be easy, and we've got way too much Hollywood in our brain as to what we're looking for. And so, no, marriage is two very needy people coming together to support each other.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard. So, and in your case, even, that times a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned the covenant relationship. I should have mentioned that when you said, why do you want to take the Christian approach to this book? Because I think it's so fundamental. And, this isn't buying a loaf of bread and you didn't like it, so you changed the brand next week.
Yeah.
This is much deeper than that. But what do you do as a Christian when you have that kind of commitment and we stress the importance of getting an answer from God about whether you should stay in your marriage. And we don't, by the way, assume that all marriages are safe and can make it. We're very explicit that there's a time to make yourself safe. I think our 4 separations illustrate that. I was unsafe. I was being abused. I was falling apart, and I needed to separate. So,
the number one point you've said has been the two elements, the faith and good mental health from trained people, from good resources.
That's right.
And these are some Christians, some are not Christians. So you highlight both of those in your book, which is really great. We need more of that. That's putting those 2 pieces up front. What would be your second and third?
Well, the boundaries, I think, are the most important. A person has to study boundaries.
Yeah. Cloud and Townsend, the classic book, Cloud and Townsend.
Yeah, and I quote that book. I recommend it in the back. I just love it, and
I think I love it because we just still don't get it. Too many Christians think that no boundaries is Christian.
Oh, okay. So interesting. So I had a hunch that many might feel that way. I did at times. Mm-hmm. There were times when my wife, I remember in our first year of marriage, I was horrified that she would follow me around the house. And when she was mad and she's like, you started this, you got me here, you're going to get me out of it. You can't go. And I would go into another room and close the door and she would pound and scream and cry. And this would go on for at least an hour. And at that point, you feel violated, but you start to wonder about the justice of not helping this poor grieving person, because you're trying to be Christian, you're trying to be loving, you're trying to be like Jesus and look beyond a person's wickedness or whatever. And so you get stuck in all of this, but at some point, then the healthy secular research helps you see that there are better ways to deal with this. And the chapter on boundaries, by the way, and I think this is one of the most fascinating for those who really are students of the Bible and love Scripture, is that it makes a parallel between our life as Christians, where we're under captivity in Egypt, like the Israelites, captivity through Satan, we're all fallen,
Mm-hmm.
and that Moses, being a type or a figure of Christ, delivers us through his wonders. We go through the Red Sea, the waters of baptism. We end up on the other side delivered, but before we know it, we start doing, making bad choices again. And God wants us to go into the promised land, but suddenly we end up in the wilderness anyway, until we can sort of get all this, filthiness and nonsense out of us. And I think this parallels our life as Christians so well, because it illustrates how God set boundaries with his people in all ages. And, Jesus, the creator and God of all, is the one who, before his earthly ministry, was the God who spoke to Moses and gave commandments and set limits and told the children of Israel, you're not going in the promised land.
Yep.
You went too far. So the righteousness of setting limits and boundaries is clearly established in Scripture, in my view. And I just can't resist this one little point here. So after they're finally permitted to go into the promised land, what did God tell them to do? He said, you need to kill or cast out all of these nations that are in there, which, by the way, there's a separate wonderful article referenced in my book about, was God a moral monster or what? Why is he commanding them to kill all these? Well, there's a lot of stuff that we know about the depravity and the cruelty and the horror of the way these people lived at the time that they were commanded to cast. But anyway, they were told to go into the promised land, and to create a secure life for themselves, they were supposed to set boundaries.
Yep.
Or God warned them that they would get all enmeshed with things that were not good for them. They would become idolatrous and all that stuff. I think that that's a great metaphor for what happens in a marriage. Is if you don't clearly say, I'm not going to accept this, I need this, blah, 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 you're just going to be all this way. You're just all, the whole codependent thing, and everything is just gets fuzzy and messy and uncomfortable, and nobody's happy. And that's why I guess I come to boundaries. You've probably seen miracles in your clients' lives as they've learned the skill of setting boundaries.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. What's your third one?
Well, actually, the first one was the brief statement about that you are empowered, that you need to believe that you can feel better, significantly better, whether your spouse changes at all.
Yeah.
To begin with.
That's right. Yes. So the first one, it's not dependent on them. That's so important.
Right.
Yes. And your calling as a husband or wife is to do your part. But what I hear from most of my clients is, but them, this, that, or the other. It's so easy to focus on someone else. And when someone else is having trouble, especially when you have a spouse with mental health issues, it's easy to completely ignore that you have any issues.
Right.
So when they actually get help, what happens is divorce comes afterwards, because now they have to actually deal with their stuff. They've actually not had to for years.
Yeah.
It's very revealing.
And we don't let our readers off the hook with that one, because that's not doing them a service. We all have issues. We have to acknowledge that there is no good guy, bad guy. There's no healthy spouse, unhealthy spouse. There might be a spouse with fewer issues, but we're all a little troubled, and certainly with sinfulness in various ways or whatever. So we hit that right head on. I'm so pleased that the people, the professionals, like the critics who have reviewed this book, have called it warm, empathetic, appealingly sympathetic. There's not a harshness about it, either to oneself or to the spouse. It's just acknowledging that this stuff is horribly difficult to deal with, but there's hope. I mean, I hate to hold us up that much as a light, but that is kind of the main reason that the book can be called, Hope and Help, is that I think there's an implicit message. If they can make it, I think we have a pretty good chance, because we were a mess.
Well, so give us some examples of what you went through being married to someone diagnosed with bipolar and other diagnoses.
So within 2 months of being married, and my wife and I had, I'm sorry, 2 months of meeting where we hadn't been married yet. Uh, and we hadn't seen each other much because I'm traveling as a musician. We're in her area, and she is telling me she knows the area well. It's her home area. I'm driving this car. She says, "Get off this exit." And I said, "Are you sure it's this one?" And she completely shut down, wouldn't talk the rest of the trip, wouldn't, it turned into 3 days with no return phone calls. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, what have I done?" And she finally came, and seemed like her old self as I perceived it. And, you know, this was an example of that kind of irretrievable anger. And this was into, I hate to say it, into even 30 years of marriage. It's really a lot better about the last 5 to 7 years after she went into a certain program. But the anger, she couldn't seem to get rid of it. And her way of later, as she got to know me more, she's like, "Well, you're my husband. You're just going to deal with it." She would just start yelling. And we didn't go past 3 days. Going more than 3 days without a major argument was rare. We would sometimes go as long as 2 weeks, but it's no exaggeration that never in the first 10 years of our marriage did we make it more than 2 weeks without a major gut-wrenching kind of argument where, and, I use this analogy in the book about, mental illness manifests usually in two ways, either feelings that are out of control and disproportionate to what we would think is appropriate, or logic and words and thinking that just is out there. And it's like vanilla and chocolate and twist. And my wife was twist. It was always emotion out of control, thoughts that didn't seem rational or reasonable. And when you get subjected to this long enough, this is why the chapters in the book are things like, "I'm so confused." So we decided to write the chapters in the way that are the most profoundly painful things that the spouse experiences. "I'm so confused. How can I start feeling like myself again?
Yeah.
I'm losing like who I am because of this stuff that keeps getting said to me. I'm starting to doubt myself and my faith. How about, can I survive this?" There's a survival instinct that kicks in, like, I'm really going to be destroyed by this. And I was very much keeping my antenna up for that feeling like this is totally killing me. I was willing to suffer in the extreme if God has his purposes. My wife is a worthwhile person. I knew she's fundamentally a good person, and I loved her. I still love her. And she was good for me in many ways. So there were, in between those 3-day very horrible arguments were still lots of fun times. I think we all need to realize that that's what makes these relationships so difficult, is balancing that this is a good person and they make me laugh a lot and they make me happy and they say nice things about me, but then they act like this and it drives me off, out of my mind. So that's the conflicted, mental ping pong, I call it. Or should I stay? Should I go? Is this worth it? Is it, it's not fair. You start feeling like it's not fair. Well, no marriage is really fair, but these kind of marriages really, I think, take that to another level.
They do, yeah. What would you say? You guys had to have made some really strong commitments and decisions to be where you're at today. You've been through so much. What were some of the key things you committed to that led to you really the last 5 to 6 years, even, where you're really thriving, where you're really in a good place? What are some of those key things?
Well, number one, for sure, I believe, is getting an answer from God. It's having a confidence that you can pray and that you can recognize godly answers, because you need that to sustain you. I'm sorry?
He wasn't praying, "Hey, God, fix it."
Well, there was a lot of that.
But that wasn't the answer. What was the answer?
Yeah, the answer was, "It's right. I will sustain you.
Yes.
You will grow. Yeah, you will grow. You will see success over time," was the answer. And then,
not just a snap of a finger and it's all fixed, which is what we're really praying for.
Right. But to answer your question about what in the last 5 to 7 years, my wife had a terrible maybe her fourth nasty in the hospital psychiatric unit, where she was really angry. Just everything just felt so awful. My job was really hard at the time. I was just running out of steam, and she wasn't giving at all. And we had heard about DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and somebody told us, you've got to get her into that kind of therapy because it's the only one that really works for borderline personality. That just stuck in my head.
Yep.
Well, at this hospital, they recommended a place in Pittsburgh that could take her full time. We actually moved to Pittsburgh for 3 months. We rented a place and moved to downtown Pittsburgh so that she could attend 5 days a week. And ironically, she was in there with the majority were court committed, not interested, could care less. They were in the opportunity of a lifetime. And she was just there, and she was committed, and she really was. And I'll tell you, those other participants, they lit her up, man. They just thought she was just a spoiled woman that didn't know what she had. They just told her what they thought. And then every night we would debrief, and counselors would kind of put her back together. But she was learning stuff that made sense, and she was beginning to recognize that her thinking, what she always thought was fair and reasonable, was really not. And there was no amount of persuasion or me explaining. In fact, I make this point in the book that the worst thing you can do as a spouse is try to, get this like defective thing out of a person's head. You just can't do it as the spouse. It has to be a professional, or it has to be themselves studying. So finally, this objective third party is helping her see, and she is like saying, I'm really happy.
Beautiful. So, I mean, what I'm hearing is, yes, praying for God to intervene and even just give perseverance, endurance, but then getting the right help. It's back to those first 2 points you made earlier. It's both and. Yeah. God working and then getting the right help.
Yeah. And I mean, that was the kind of the final push into more normalcy. And there's still been some challenges since then, but I think we probably right now have fewer really painful challenges than a lot of couples out there. And in fact, since this book came out, some of our friends that we just recently met that never knew about our past, one just for weeks, she just would say, I just can't believe it. I can't believe you guys, this couple here.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so that is validation that from the outside, people sense that we're a happy couple, that we're loving, and so there is hope. There really is. And my wife doesn't write much in the book. I'm the primary author, but there's a section of each chapter that is her perspective. And one of the PhD psychology professionals that reviewed this book said that he felt that was one of the most unique and important contributions of the book, is that it juxtaposes the description from the healthier spouse's view with how the other person was thinking at the time. And it's very stark. When you read it, it's like, oh, no wonder it was so hard. But it provides a dose of reality.
Wow, I love that. And that definitely, a question I was going to ask is about what makes the book unique, but that's definitely one of them. I love to hear that.
It is.
It sounds like you've got a lot of validation too. When does the book hit the public? Where they can
let me actually pull up an image of it, because I think it's
love that title, happyafterall.info.
Yeah. So that's where your viewers can go to learn a bit more about it. So August 12th, the ebook is live on Amazon. And the paperback won't be available till November 2nd. With lovely COVID challenges, even the printers are struggling to stay afloat, keep up. But anyway, she wanted to write this because she felt like if I wouldn't have found some ways to keep myself together, our marriage would have failed. And so she's like, can you put some of that together? And I am a professional instructional designer. So the
Oh, I
other thing
love
that makes this,
so great.
yeah, it really, the pieces come together. And
Mm.
I, I honestly believe God has pruned and shaped my life, our life, to be able to put something together to help a lot of folks who are suffering right now.
This is, I think, critical. What does the subtitle say? Hope and help for you.
When your spouse has mental health or addiction issues.
Wonderful.
So
Yeah.
it'll help, spiritually strengthen.
Mhm.
There's beautiful metaphors in there. I mean, anybody who loves the Bible will love how it's sprinkled in with biblical scripture, some wonderful stories like around unfairness, and like King David when he was, I don't know if you guys remember the story where King David snapped and he's like, strap on your swords because we're going to kill all the men in this particular camp. He just had it. And then what happens next is just a beautiful metaphor for when we feel like snapping and when we need help from God.
Neat.
Stuff like that.
Love it. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to get this out there. I'm excited to see what God does with this book. And you have another one as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. So 3 years ago, this was a 20-year project.
Wow.
When I worked at that juvenile corrections facility, there was a young man sitting in my class, told him that a counselor had given him a Bible, and he was very frustrated. He's like, I can't understand this. And I knew he was right. He had a poor reading ability and didn't know anything about the Bible. Just to go in cold, it's hard. So at the time, I was reading a scholarly book about the life of Jesus and his teachings, and it was creating a movie-like experience. And what I wanted to do was create a guided tour with a kindly guide who would walk through from birth to resurrection in the Savior's life and help make it relevant for that person.
Oh,
And
yes.
that's what's happened. That's what it is.
Yes. Love
So
that. And if you go to happyafterall.info on the top, you can link. There's a link to all the rest of what you do. This other book, it's also on Amazon.
Yeah. And if they go to happyafterall.info, info, not .com, info, then that there's a button to download 3 free chapters of this book. Nice. And that's doesn't even require email signature, but I'd love it if you subscribe elsewhere on the site. But you'll get instant download to those chapters. And hey, we're just excited to get this out there finally.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to meet you and to talk with you, and look forward to seeing what God does with this, because it's definitely, to me, God is a redeemer. Yeah. And so how you, no matter what the future holds, but how you use this as a platform to affect lives. There are way too many people out there hurting. As we talked about in the beginning, just the mental health realities. We're becoming more aware of it. And I actually think we're going backwards in some areas where it's not helping, it's hurting because of some of the resources out there. So this is a beautiful addition that's helpful. It's encouraging. It's full of light. Yeah,
I believe that it is. I believe it was God inspired in many ways. And as I've been rereading it the last, as we're finishing production here, I've been deeply touched at how this has all come together to be very, very valuable for folks. That's wonderful. So wonderful. Well, thanks for this time. Corey, thank you. All you're doing. Look forward to continuing to follow you, and you can also follow you on all social media as well, right? We'll have all those links in the show notes, and bless you in your marriage and your influence. Thank you so much for all you do and for giving us this opportunity to share this. Pleasure. Thank you for tuning in to the Family Features Podcast. It has been an honor to serve. Find out more about Dr. Gilbert and his resources for you and your family's growth and success at healinglives.com. And if you think you could use some support along the way, be sure to book that call at bookdrg.com. And one more thing, if you found this helpful, please share this podcast with others so that we can change the world together.